Yeah, so for everyone who is new here, we're Coalition Z. We're a national student-run policy organization that aims to connect our generation to government and progressive activism by electing progressive candidates that we align with, connecting young people to candidates and campaigns, and lobbying for our progressive policy platform. So if you're interested in getting involved, as Charlotte mentioned, we have a mailing list. We also are completely made up of student-run chapters throughout the country. So if you're interested in starting a chapter, Durga can drop the link for that in the chat box. And then you can also obviously follow us on Instagram and Twitter to just keep track of the events like this that we're hosting. So we're trying to do this more often. Durga can also put that in the chat box. Sorry, Durga, you can do it. But anyway, without further ado, let's get into the event today. Today we obviously have Luke Hayes with us. Luke Hayes has been part of the progressive political world for quite some time now, most recently serving as a campaign manager for Jamaal Bowman's successful run in New York. He's previously worked with Alessandra Biaggi, who, for New York folks here, ran against a member of the IDC, which is this like conservative Democratic member group of our state senate, and won in 2018. He's worked for Kaine, Barack Obama, and of course for other New York folks has led Tiffany Caban's campaign for district attorney, which ended up losing by 55 votes, but was this really great progressive leftist DA campaign in Queens. So good. But anyway, so what we're doing today is we are as Charlotte mentioned earlier, we're going to have some structured questions to get the conversation started. And then in a little bit, we're going to move into questions from the crowd. So, yeah.
Yeah, so again, thank you all so much for being here. Excited to get the conversation started. And also make sure to check in for our other conversations throughout the week. A lot of awesome speakers, which you can check out at coalition.z. So just to get things started out, how did you get involved in electoral politics? And for those interested in getting involved with campaigns as a career, how would you suggest getting started?
Sure. So I volunteered on campaigns. Actually, coincidentally enough, I volunteered on Elliot Engel's campaign back in 2000. When I grew up in the district and handed out some flyers at a couple of events. So volunteering is always a great way to kind of get your foot in the door. And there's they're kind of big campaigns like a presidential or a Senate or a gubernatorial. Then there are smaller campaigns for city council, Congress, assembly, things like that. And both are great. Being on a presidential, comes with its benefits and its drawbacks. Smaller campaigns, not as high name recognition, but as someone who's volunteering and starting off, you might get pulled into a couple of different projects. So you might not, your candidate might still not be well known, but you might work on some field portions, some digital portions, finance and digital. So yeah, I started in high school, was, politically aware and active, like all of you, I'm assuming, was seen as like the political one among my group of friends, though it seems like your generation is a little bit more tuned in. The late 90s were not exactly the most interesting time politically in terms of what was going on in the world. But yeah, I started in high school and, been involved ever since.
Awesome. So can you walk us through the process of running a campaign from its initial stages before the campaign is announced to getting the vote out and then the final stretch? So what does your role as campaign manager look like throughout this process?
Sure. So, for a candidate that's interested in running, you want to have a talk with them on just kind of like what their vision is, why they're running. Want to make sure a candidate really knows what they're running for. And then you also want to do a little bit of like a reality check. Running for office, can be an intense experience. And it's just like, it's a grind for many months at a time. And if you have a family or, personal obligations, it's just, you're always on. Some days can be 14, 15, 16 hours, and that's a lot to do. So you want to make sure you're kind of letting a candidate know what they're getting into. Obviously, there are some things you can't anticipate, but you do want to get them into the mindset of, what sort of, project they're about to endeavor on. And early on with campaigns, what you want to do is start with your social network. and kind of reach out to like people that you already know to kind of build up momentum, to build up some money to spend on staff and to spend on supplies. It also gives you a chance to, refine your stump speech. The first time you say your stump speech is very different from the time you say it, the day before election day. And if you're able to do a house party at your friend's place or, whatever it might be, you can practice it, right? You can be in front of an audience that's going to be receptive to you, that's going to be comfortable with you, and you can start to really kind of get that going. So the first couple stages of a campaign are kind of just setting up a routine for yourself, getting used to talking about, your story. So if you ask any candidate by the time election day comes around, like you could literally wake them up in the middle of the night and they could just recite the recite the stump speech because they've said it so many times, but that's not where they start. So candidates have to get used to it. They have to practice it. And you want to lay out a plan. So for a lot of campaigns, you start off small in terms of what the staff looks like and what the activity looks like, just in terms of, a variety of things, right? You've seen probably commercials for campaigns on TV. You'll notice they're always about a month or so before election day. I wouldn't advise a candidate a year out from running to put something on TV. It's expensive. People not remember it. So there's all these sorts of things that you want to think through about phases of the campaign. So usually you work backwards. So if you know when your election is, you kind of work backwards from that for some distinct markers that you want to be aware of. So if your state has early vote or absentee voting, you want to be aware of when that happens because that'll shift your strategy about how you're talking to them. There might be some significant events coming up in the lead up to election day. You always want to make note of, important holidays or other things that are going on, and kind of, map it backwards to where you're starting. And then from there, a lot of the first part of the campaign, on Jamaal's campaign, the first 6 months of the campaign, it was, making calls for money, talking to local activist groups, going to tenant, meetings, going to house parties and talking to people in their living room 12 at a time, and just getting a chance to expose himself to folks so they could, learn more about him. And also it's a good chance to get what does the community care about? If you're running for office, you want to hear from people in the community. That really helps shape where the policy goes and where, some of the more fleshed out parts of your stump go. So if you're hearing from parents across the district that schools need to be better, you're going to want to talk about that to really appeal to folks. Or you're hearing about school debt, you're hearing about, Medicare for all, whatever it might be, you want to, get that incorporated. So the beginning parts of a campaign can be a little slow, just because, there's not a lot going on, but I'd say the last 2-3 months of a campaign, you really see a ramp up in terms of activity, staff, and just energy around the campaign. Sorry, and your last part, sorry. Role as campaign manager, it is a combination of, team captain, and kind of taskmaster. I'd like to say it's like a fun job, but a lot of my job was like being on conference calls and just following up that this is getting done and this is getting done, and just like you're keeping the wheels and the machinery of the campaign going. And that's one thing I'll say to all of you is campaigns are fun and exciting. You make lifelong friends on them. But there are definitely dull parts, whether you're doing calls to voters for 3 hours in a row or knocking on doors, whatever it might be. There are some parts where it's like, this is a bit of a drag. And, as campaign manager, one thing you want to be mindful of is the morale of the team, just because everyone's got bad days. For those of you who have done voter contact on the phones or in person, there are assholes out there that are just going to be mean to you for whatever reason. And, it's hard to get 3 of those conversations in a row on the phone, on the doors, or on the phones can be tough. And then sometimes, you have to deal with a crisis. Something comes up that, you gotta address. But you want to keep people focused and engaged and really remind them why they're here. Because campaigns are a lot of work, a lot of, emotional labor. And, sometimes, feelings can get hurt or frayed. People can just get tired. And you want to make sure you're keeping focused on what the ultimate goal is and working towards that.
Sam, you want to ask your question, our youth cabinet member?
So hi, I'm Sam, and
Hi.
my question is, why do you feel that progressive campaigns are, why do you think that progressive challenges in like the Democratic Party are important? And also, in regards to recent progressive victories, do you think that there is you know, like what is your vision, I guess, for the future of the Democratic Party? And do you think, you know, are you optimistic? Do you think it's all going to turn around?
Yeah, so I think primaries are important in general just because ideas and concepts sometimes get stale. And I think primaries are a good way to kind of, you know, address something like, okay, you know, the party or candidate's been saying this for 10, 12 years. Is that the right approach? And I think, you know, having a dialogue within a party about what is the best way to achieve their goals and what the goals are is a good, you know, you want to see that. You know, I know it can get nasty online, and I go back and forth about whether I want to keep Twitter on my phone. But I think overall it's a healthy discussion because I think it engages people. It brings people in, and kind of it's healthy to see this sort of debate. And I always frame it with like Democrats versus Republicans is, you know, on the Democratic side, you know, if you're having 6 candidates all say how they're going to achieve universal health care, that's already a great frame for the debate because you're establishing that we should have access to healthcare, and now you're hearing different ideas about how to get it. And I think that's good, can really kind of appeal to a lot of folks and draw new people in because maybe there's that one candidate talking about an idea that no one's really addressed before, and that can be, you know, that can be powerful. And I think it also helps keep incumbents sharp. And we see this a lot of times with incumbents is sometimes they don't do their due diligence of being out in the community and engaging with voters. And what we've seen here in New York, and I'm sure you've seen in other parts of the country, is that when primary challenges happen, the incumbent, you start to see them hustling more. You know, you see them at a subway stop, you see them at the fish fry, you see them at a variety of places that normally they don't show up. And the primaries are really good about kind of forcing them to get up and defend what their record is and what their ideas are. And sometimes that's effective and sometimes that works. But either way, it's kind of forcing folks to tune in, engage, and educate themselves. And I think for the incumbents, it helps kind of keep them sharp. You know, like, why are you in office? Why do you deserve to go there for another 2-4 years and represent us? So I think there's you know, a lot of good that can come from this. And I know, like, in the thick of it, you're kind of like, oh, I can't stand, you know, candidate X or their supporters. But overall, I think it's, you know, generally healthy for the party. I remain optimistic. It's a weird time to be optimistic. I will be the first to admit. The kind of crisis that are coming our way, whether it's, you know, global warming, which is a real existential threat, you know, to the planet, to other things that seem like, you know, we're you know, stuck in the mud about. But I think the progressive primaries and the challengers that are winning and the kind of momentum behind that is really encouraging to me. Just because, you know, you know, the first campaign I worked out of college in 2005 was working on Tim Kaine's race in Virginia for governor. And I just remember, you know, I'd volunteered a bit with the John Kerry campaign and that whole thing in 2004, and just where the discussion is in 2004 and where it is now is so different. You know, Medicare for all was always seen as that's never going to happen. Why even talk about it? You know, gay marriage in 2004, you know, gay marriage was, you know, something that Republicans used against Democrats. And there was this, you know, like, how are you going to, you know, stain this, you know, sanctity of marriage with gay marriage? And now in 2020, it's, you know, it's legal. Supreme Court ruled on it. So just like there are shifts that have happened, you know, on a lot of policy positions that are encouraging, and they've continued to happen, especially in the last 4 years, since 2016. So I remain optimistic about that. And also I think optimism is essential to kind of staying in campaigns, because it's hard to do this sort of work if you're pessimistic about it. It'll just burn you out. And I'm someone who's optimistic, and even I get burnt out. So I'd say optimism, if you can keep that hope kindled, it'll, you know, really help, you know, push you through.
So my next question is, how do you, in the various campaigns that you've worked on, have you seen any differences between working for a more progressive campaign and working for someone who was more establishment? I guess in your history, like Obama would be a more establishment person, although maybe not at the time, right? Do you feel, or did you see any major differences in how campaigns were carried out?
Yeah, so I think Obama's a good example just because, you know, I started off with him in his campaign in 2007 when he was the, you know, the progressive insurgent. And I remember, you know, I was in Vegas for the prime, you know, for the caucuses for months. And in 2007, you know, one of the kind of pastimes we would do after call time was we go around and be like, who butchered his name the worst this time? So like people called him Obakis, Baracus, Barama, like just people like, you know, left and right. I literally had a conversation with someone being like, oh, Barack Obama is running for president there. Barack Obama is like, yeah. It's like, I was like, yeah, you know, senator from Illinois. It's like, is he black? I'm like, yeah. He's like, I remember the guy being like, yeah, good luck with that. And like hung up, you know? So it's just like, to go from people not knowing who he was to 4 years later, I went back to Nevada for the re-elect, and everyone knew who he was, for good and for bad. And, you know, just the dynamics, I'd say, for, you know, running a re-election or being on an establishment campaign or, you know, presidential campaign is, you know, there are certain obstacles that you don't have to worry about, like name recognition is one. You know, access to networks and allies, you know, when you have, especially in a red versus blue condition, you know, all the labor unions are usually on the side of the president. Environmental groups, you know, different special interest groups of the Democratic coalition are all pretty much aligned. And they have people that want to volunteer. They're doing programs that can help. So you just have like a much broader sort of coalition pushing for your candidate. And usually, I mean, on a presidential, it's countered by the other side. So that's intimidating. I would say being on a progressive campaign, like some of the insurgents that have been, you know, involved with the last few years, is it's definitely leaner. So you don't have access to quite as many resources that you'd like. So you have to be a little bit creative on how you're going to achieve your goals. But there's also something nice about, you know, Tiffany Caban was a good example of, there's something liberating about having a very kind of like clear answer to something. So cash bail came up a lot with the district attorney's race. And I remember, you know, you go to these forums and there were candidates talking about, you know, I believe in ending cash bail except for these circumstances. And they'd go through these kind of like very sort of whatever finite, like in this circumstance or this scenario, we're not going to end cash bail or this and that. And then Tiffany Caban could get up there and be like, I'm going to end cash bail, end of story. So just like being able to just be very kind of upfront and direct and not have to like parcel out these sort of like hypotheticals is refreshing. And I think people really responded to that. And yeah, on progressive campaigns too, there's also, you know, a lot of times you find people that have normally not been very involved in politics. And, you know, maybe if I kind of looked at elections as not their thing or it's all corrupt, why even bother? So you get some new perspectives and some new energy that can be really fun to work with, just because people will kind of bring a different perspective to something that you've done. And someone that's worked on a lot of campaigns, sometimes you don't even think of an aspect or a tactic until someone else comes out. And I think Coalition Z is a good example. And like that comes out generationally. You know, I have people on staff with the Bowman campaign that have talked about TikTok and the need to do a TikTok. I am that old guy that doesn't really know much about TikTok. I know it exists. But you know, just little things like that where, you know, if you go to this venue, use this platform or use these things, it kind of opens you up to a whole new audience that otherwise isn't getting engaged. And on progressive challenges where you have to kind of think outside the box in the establishment, it forces you to be creative, and that can be a swing and a miss sometimes, but it can also lead to really, you know, some fun experiments.
Yeah, for sure. We'll ask a few more questions and then we'll open it up. But especially in the context of the campaigns that you've worked on recently, like Tiffany Caban and Jamaal Bowman, who were primary challengers, what makes a good candidate? And how did someone like Jamaal Bowman do it? How did you guys run such a successful campaign, given how enshrined Eliot Engel was?
Sure. So having a good candidate opens up a lot of things for a campaign. If there are any basketball fans out there, my analogy is like if you have a 7-footer on a high school basketball team, like it's just like you can do a lot of things, just like just stand there. So a good candidate can kind of open up a lot of doors. And good candidates come in all kind of shapes and sizes and aspects. You know, one thing I really liked about Jamaal was he's very naturally curious. So it was, you know, he'd go to these screenings with groups, and sometimes, and it was also refreshing because he was honest. Sometimes they'd ask him about something. He's like, oh, I don't know about that issue, but I want to learn more. And sometimes politicians kind of bullshit their way through an answer. And it's like, people can pick up at that. And Jamaal, you know, was just very blunt on sometimes like, you know, this like obscure reference in a housing policy, like, oh, what's his stance on like, you know, I-35A? And it's like, he's like, I don't know that specific clause, but I want to learn more. So people really kind of, you know, engage with that. You know, with Alessandra Biaggi, she was, you know, she was super energetic, and like people really responded to that. So just like meeting voters at like a subway station, people, you could see kind of people really kind of like responded to, their conversations with her. So a lot of times, I think kind of blanket assessment I'd say about like good candidates is being able to engage with people. And I say this as an introvert. Watching a candidate work is exhausting to me because I'm kind of like, after a while I can be like, all right, I need some space. So candidates really need to be able to engage with people in a really authentic way. Being smart, book smart, but also street smart, and just kind of being able to pick up on things is really helpful too. And all the candidates I've worked for have been really smart and kind of had a natural, curiosity. And then also work ethic. Running for office is a lot of work. And, it's, no one likes to get up at 5:30 a.m. to go to a subway stop. And there are some days where it's just like, if I have to call one more donor, or I have to call another voter, or I have to knock on this last door, it's tough. And especially if they have, kids, family, things like that. Just being very diligent about sticking to that routine. And all those things really lead to a great candidate. And also like a kind of indescribable sort of like charisma. I don't know how to like quantify that. But, a lot, candidates tend to be charismatic people. So when they walk into a room, like folks take notice, and just having that presence. And I don't know how to like say it other than like some cheap buzzword, but it's true. If you've ever been in the room with a dynamic candidate, you're kind of like, oh, like he's pretty good, or she's really impressive. You just kind of like pick up on that vibe. And I say that as someone who's like seen some local candidates, especially kind of down ballot. You understand now why people like, Barack Obama, I can only imagine him in the state Senate with some of his colleagues, people being like, that guy's impressive. Some of the other ones, maybe not as much, but that guy's, there's something about him. So yeah, I think the sort of presence and charisma can be really, I know it's like hard to define that, but I think everyone here knows like that sort of quality.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you grew up in Eliot Engel's district and you got involved with his campaign or office when you were young. What have you learned about your community through working for Bowman's campaign?
That's a good question. And it's actually one of my favorite parts about doing field organizing, is you really get to know the communities really well. And just, yeah, I mean, it's like sometimes you'll kind of stumble upon kind of subcultures within a building. Like maybe there's a building that's like really close together because they did a tenant strike or banding against the doorman, not the doorman, the banding against the landlord. So you get to really hear a lot from the community about like what matters to them. And it's also a good reality check. As someone that's, on campaigns, you can kind of get into the bubble. And we see this with social media where it's like, oh, everyone agrees with me. Like, how can anyone vote for Trump? And then you get, blindsided. So field organizing is great because it humbles you in a way, in the sense that like you're obsessed with this candidate. Like this even happened with Bowman. It's like you think everyone's talking about it, and then you go on the phones and people are like, oh, is he that teacher guy that's running for Congress? It's like, yes, he is that teacher guy running for Congress. And so, it kind of keeps you honest about where people's focus is, and also what issues like really kind of resonate with folks. Because I think sometimes there's a perception from us, like, oh, people really care about issue X, Y, and Z. And then, having a good field operation, talking to voters, knocking on their doors, all that can really give you helpful feedback on being like, okay, this is an issue that people just don't care about, or maybe they're not aligned with the candidate. So it can be a great way to just like let you know like where the pulse is. And also I think it really kind of breaks down, I think conveniently try to bucket voters into these very kind of broad, general characteristics. And from one door to the next, in a neighborhood, you might get grilled for 7 minutes on how you're going to pay for Medicare for all. And then the next time it's like, oh, you guys running against Engel? Yeah, he's got my vote. I can't stand Engel. So it's just like, they might be both like, 35-year-old white women. And one of them is really obsessed with like how you're going to pay for Medicare for all. And the other one already is like, I don't like Engel. I'm going to vote for your candidate. So I think it's good to just kind of, same thing. Sometimes we like construct the idea of what a voter cares about and what they're interested in. And yeah, being able to communicate with them really, I think it keeps you honest in a really great way.
Awesome. So we just have one more question and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So in terms of, so given that you had to run a campaign during COVID, how has COVID changed campaigning, and how do you think these tactics will stay in campaigns going forward?
That's March and April were long months. My joke is that March and April were a long year. It felt like I just remember it was finally like April 28th. It was like, damn, like that felt like a while. I think a couple things that came from this is I think it forced a lot more campaigns to be much more present digitally, and I think explore all the ways to interact with folks online. I think we've all become experts on Zoom and platforms like this. So I think that's been I think that's kind of accelerated the growth. And I always think of technology. You'll find this a lot on campaigns. It's like a lot of times it's people like us running it, younger folks. And for me, it's always like, can my dad pull this off? And he's 72. We got him on the predictive dialer. He was on Zoom calls and like did the phone banking. So I was always like, I told my like field people, I was like, great job. Like my dad's not the most tech literate, but you got him doing things that I otherwise would have been like, no, there's no way. So I think that's been good about kind of like the just general sort of, I think, awareness and interaction with the digital side and the tech side. I think it also exposed, though, like there are some shortcomings with this sort of digital divide. So all of you are probably, can run laps around me when it comes to like all the different social media platforms and ways to do this. But when you think of mom or grandma, it's like, does your 81-year grandma who's living in a building, is she tuning into Facebook Live? And like some are and some aren't. So, COVID was good in that I think it pushed us to be much better on digital platforms, but I think it also really exposed the tech gap that exists in society. So just, one of the things like Jamaal and I become very kind of like, talk about more is like, making the internet like a public utility. Like people just need access to Wi-Fi. It's just like a way of, it's a way of life. Like especially now, if like kids are going to be learning from home, people are going to be working from home, like everyone needs access to the internet. That's just not something that everyone does have. So yeah, those sorts of things I think have resonated with folks. I would say like the kind of rapid digital growth has been good, but I don't think it also makes everyone miss knocking on doors. Just because as effective as calls can be and texting can be, I think it also, we realize too that how valuable that sort of face-to-face contact with a candidate in a campaign is. And I think everyone's waiting for the day where that happens again, just to kind of be able to really connect. Because, there's nothing better than having like your candidate talking to a living room of like 15 people and just like everyone's just like enthralled and like tuned in. And it's hard to really simulate that digitally. So I think COVID in some ways has solidified and accelerated some things that are really effective for campaigns on like the phone, tech and digital side. But I think it's also made us very aware of how vital and essential, that sort of interaction with candidates face to face can be.
Yeah, so thank you. We're going to open it up to the audience first. I'm sorry, now. So I said it before, but just to ask a question, you can type it in the chat. You can raise your hand and I'll try to see you, or you can raise your hand virtually. So our first question is from Lucia, who has risen her hand. So Lucia, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so why do you think is it important for campaigns to engage young people? And how have the campaigns that you've run specifically engaged young people?
I think it's essential just because I think you want to be aware of like all the people that are affected by your policies. And young people, a lot of high schoolers are in this kind of gray area where they're, they can show some political agency and be involved and active, but they can't actually vote for these policies. And especially like something like climate change and whatnot that impacts your future, our future collectively. It's you don't have that ability to really say I'm voting for candidate X because of this. So I think young people are essential to engage because they are the future. I know it's cliche, but it's like all of you are going to be voters. If you're not voters yet, you're going to be voters the next time around. You want to make sure you're not, ignoring a growing segment of your district. I think also for, just for volunteer, activity and things like that, young people, can be really helpful. And I say this as someone that doesn't have kids, but you have more free time than your parents do. And, that's free time, you'll realize in 10 years is awesome and amazing, and we want to apply that to something that can, really transform transform things for the better. And then I think there's also, for a country, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but I'm sure a lot of you have peers that are not as in tune or plugged into politics. And I think it's, I think we're seeing now, like, if you're not paying attention, the other side will do some terrible stuff. And I think, everything we've seen about voting and volunteering and staying engaged is it's habit forming. So for, and the data will back this up. It's like, if you're someone who's voted in a presidential and a primary by the time you're 21 years old, I don't need to worry about you as much as, say, your friend who like registered to vote and voted, in a presidential, but doesn't know what midterms are, or never voted in a primary. The more that we can get folks engaged at an earlier stage, to be not just voters, but volunteers and active, amazing things can happen. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, I think a lot of you have become more politically aware in the last few years. And what we're seeing is, a very big shift on the Democratic side of like progressive primary challengers, and a new sort of conversation around a lot of very, crucial ideas. And I think a lot of that is due to like this infusion of new energy and new ideas from people like yourself.
Awesome. Our next question is from Unique, so feel free to unmute yourself.
So before you mentioned how when you started out, you volunteered by handing out flyers and physically being there, but obviously we can't really do that right now. So what are some ways that you would recommend to start like volunteering in a campaign without, but COVID, but being safe?
Sure. So I think one is digital. Like, if you have a platform that you like to use, you can, retweet or repost or share, postings from the candidate, just to kind of introduce it to your social network. And that's a kind of low lift. I think a more in-depth lift would be relational organizing. So get your parents to plug in, get family friends to plug in, get siblings to plug in. You can, we all get 1,000 emails from campaigns and organizations that we don't read. It's okay, you can admit that. But if you send an email to your neighbors saying why you support, your candidate, that carries a lot of weight. And I think, one of the things about organizing is realizing your own power and potential as an advocate and validator for candidates and issues that you really feel passionately about. And the analogy I make is, campaigns are very similar to marketing, in that you might see a commercial for a movie, see a bunch of reviews for a movie. Oh, this movie's great, I got to go see it. And then your neighbor says, I saw it last night and it kind of sucked. You might eventually go and see that movie, but your neighbor just saying like, yeah, the movie kind of sucked, you can wait for it to come out online. Like, that one interaction with your neighbor is negating millions of dollars of ad spending to convince you need to see that movie. And I think that's where organizing can be really helpful, especially for some down ballot races. I think with with Biden Trump, I don't know how many undecideds there are. Like, I'd be genuinely curious to interview someone who's like weighing the pros and cons of Biden versus Trump. But for some assembly or congressional races where people just aren't as tuned in, you saying like, you should really check out Cori Bush. She's a great candidate that's got a lot of great ideas. That carries a lot of weight. And I think one thing I would add on to that is it's not one conversation. So part of politics is straddling that line of annoying people and being persistent. So I think in your relational organizing, like, draw up a list of people that you're comfortable talking to and reaching out to in your social network, in your family network, in your community network, and really advocate for your candidate. And I think that's a great way for you to plug in and being really effective for something you believe in.
Great. Our next question is from Perry, so feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi. Are there any smaller races that you've been following currently that maybe aren't as well known, but ones that like you find important to follow right now?
That is a good. I've kind of been in the campaign bubble, so I'm gonna. I've actually been neglectful of some of the down ballot races. I would say, like, right now there aren't a lot of primaries left. I think we just saw like Minnesota and like one or two other states that went yesterday. I think Massachusetts is like the last state to go at the beginning of September. So I think the primary challenges have died down a bit. I will say, like, the people paying attention to district attorney races is significant. District attorneys have a ton of, power that I don't think a lot of voters realize. And it's nice to see, Democrats and left organizations really focus on that, because I think that's an issue, or that's an office that was often ignored. So I would say nothing, I can't think of a particular name or race that stands out to me, but I would say district attorney races have been flying under the radar for years. But also things like city council, a lot of times, like, it's a stepping stone for someone that might end up becoming, a congressional or Senate candidate. And I think it's, it's hard to say one office over another. District attorney does come to mind as something that's, like, I think pretty significant. But I would, yeah, I mean, people always use the joke of, like, oh, they're running for dog catcher and whatever. But, certain states have, sometimes they have commissions or boards that are really powerful that a lot of people don't know about. I think some states have, like, water commissions and water boards that really regulate a lot of land use that can be pretty significant. School board is a big thing. And actually, the Christian right has been organizing school board elections for years. And it's a big reason why a lot of your textbooks and curriculum has stuff that's very regressive when it comes to talking about slavery in America, women's rights, union rights, and things like that. So I'd say district attorney and school board are two places that a lot of people don't spend a lot of time, but can have a lot of impact on your day-to-day life.
Our next question is from Stravia. She asked, what kind of dialogue do you think more center-leaning Democrats and more progressive Democrats should be engaging in right now? Why is it important, especially with regards to promoting party unity, an appealing platform, and real change?
That's a good question. I have a kind of a disposition to be nice. So it's weird to be in politics because it gets a little, there's some sharp elbows out there. I think one thing that's helped me is I have relatives, like aunts and uncles and cousins, that are Republican. So growing up, it was kind of like, credit to my parents for kind of protecting me from some of the more intense political battles. But I think, I think there's kind of an instinct, and understandably, if sometimes, like, someone from the other political side is like this, like, bloodthirsty, right winger, and it's like, no, like, a lot of people, like, their political affiliation to define who they are. I think that's changing a little bit in the last few years, but I think it helps kind of, like, keep you grounded. And as someone that worked for establishment Democrats, and still has friends that worked on a variety of establishment candidates, and, like, they'd give me a hard time about my my socialist leanings. I think I'm trying to think of a way to create dialogue. I think it's a good question, and something I think that needs to happen, because I think it's good to be passionate about things you believe in. I think it's good to have discussions, because I think it sharpens your ability to defend your position. So don't shy away from debates. But I also think, like, one thing to keep in mind, especially with intra Democratic Party values, is just because someone doesn't agree with necessarily your line of reasoning, or maybe your kind of 3-step process to universal healthcare, I think always kind of try to remind yourself that, like, a lot of this is coming from a good place. And I say that not to, like, say, like, good intentions kind of mask everything. But I would give people the benefit of the doubt within, at least, like, Democratic Party, is that, there are neoliberal people that really do believe that the free market can help, solve issue X. And that you might fucking way that can happen. But, they're coming from a belief of, like, yeah, they think it's horrible that people are dying because they can't afford insulin too, or they think it's horrible that, we have, these perverse incentives to burn coal over, wind power, or whatever it might be. So I would say kind of go into that, and, like, I think there's also an instinct to jump in and start just attacking without processing what they're saying. And I think that makes you less effective a debater, because you want to listen to their points to be able to kind of go through line by line, like, why or how you think they're wrong. But also it's like a little bit of respect that you want to show to someone, of just kind of like, I'm going to hear where your perspective's coming from. I may not agree with it, but I want to, like, get the full picture. And yeah, I mean, I wish there was a way to create a space for dialogue, because Twitter is definitely not the place for it, and neither is Facebook. So I don't have a good answer on how to pull off the dialogue, but I think it's a good question, and it's a good kind of disposition to have, that, you know, we do need to talk to the kind of Democratic family at large, because I think, you know, as someone that kind of broke away from more establishment people, there are friends of mine that are, you know, work for candidates or campaigns, but they're to the left of them a little bit. So there are people that are receptive to the kind of progressive alternative. But sometimes it's, I think sometimes what we do on the left is we make people kind of grovel and say, yes, you were right, I was wrong. And sometimes that's not the most effective way to grow your, you know, to grow your coalition.
Yeah, absolutely. So Omri asked, what are some strategies that you've used or would recommend on engaging people who have stayed out of the political arena for years? How do you build trust with people who naturally distrust government and all politicians?
Whew. That is hard. I think a lot of people have very legit reasons for thinking politicians are full of crap. I would say, I think a good recent example of good politics is good policy is good politics. For those of you that live in New York, when we got rid of the IDC, you know, Democrats went to Albany in 2019 and had one of the most productive legislative sessions like ever in a state's history. And just a lot of great laws were passed on housing, on women's rights, on labor. Like there was just like a whole slew of accomplishments that happened because Democrats finally got power, and they used that power to make people's lives better. And I think that's one of the more frustrating things from you know, that people get from politicians is like, there's all this talk and then the action is, you know, nothing happens. We're seeing this now with like the stimulus and that, you know, and I'm going to definitely blame Republicans because Mitch McConnell's just the fucking worst. But just like the inability to just like move on getting people the basic money to pay rent and groceries and things like that. And it's frustrating. And I think, you know, that hanging over everything, it's hard. And it's not, again, this is not a process where it's like one conversation is going to make someone a converter to be like, okay, you're right, I should, you know, I'll vote this time around. I would say to engage people that are otherwise, you know, jaded about the political system. And again, I think if you go into that knowing, there's a lot of legit reasons why people aren't engaged in politics. So again, hearing them out, and kind of find out what turns them off about politics, right? Just kind of like try to elicit answers, because you might find yourself agreeing, being like, yeah, that, you know, that was a bad move, or no, I don't know why it works like that. And then secondly, try to find out some issues that are important to them. You know, so if there's something that they're really passionate about, whether it's like they're staring at a mountain of student debt, or, you know, their family got evicted from a house, or whatever it might be. You know, I think once you find something that they're passionate about, you can start to make those connections for them, being like, well, that's a good example. And that's why we need to change it. And the only way we change that is, you know, voting or advocating for, you know, for this politician. But I would go into those conversations with an open mind, and just understand that, like, yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be jaded about the political process. You know, and, you know, I say this again, like from the perspective of someone that's been on the inside, who's a cis white gendered male, like, you know, you know, my position and my kind of optimism is shaped by all of that. And I think just, you know, there's a lot of people that are oppressed for a variety of reasons. And I think just knowing where you're coming from, knowing where they're coming from, I think can help start that dialogue of why they're so jaded about a system that, quite frankly, is very understandable to be why folks are pissed about it. Because it's let a lot of people down. I think the combination of Trump and COVID has really kind of exposed just how inept the government has been on some things. And yeah, I think that's kind of where you can start, and hopefully you can get people interested. And if not, all the more reason that I think if Democrats come in with Biden and we get a Senate majority and we pass some good laws that actually make people's lives better, I think, you know, if you have proof to show that, like, hey, shit was bad in, you know, July of 2020, but a year later it's better because Democrats did this, that helps. You know, I think people respond to action and like tangible benefits to their life.
Yeah, for sure. So our next question is from Josephine. So you can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thank you. So I've always heard that, especially in campaigns, building a really strong network is really important. So how have you really prioritized building a network and keeping in touch with people who you've come in contact with and worked with on previous campaigns?
That's a good question, and a good point. Like networking on campaigns, for some of you that are like involved with this, you're 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So one thing I've found is like, if I don't know someone, I know someone who worked with someone on a Senate race in Montana or a gubernatorial race, in Idaho, whatever it might be. I think you have to be intentional about networking. So if there are people that you like in politics, like follow up with them. I was going to say go grab a beer with them, but that's not really age appropriate. Or really possible at this time. But I would say if there are people that like you just like connect with and you're like, oh, this is someone who's like a friend or a potential friend, try to, I think, meet with them outside of the context of like political organizing. So maybe it's to go see a movie together or walk a dog or whatever it might be. And I think also just be diligent about kind of maintaining that contact. So, just making sure that like every few months or so you're checking in with them or you kind of interact with them, like shoot them a text about something. One thing I try to do is I try to like associate certain like songs or foods or whatever with people in my personal network just to kind of like give them a shout out. So, one of my best friends from a campaign, what we used to do to like de-stress was like get mac and cheese. So anytime I'll get mac and cheese, I'll like shoot her a text and be like, hey, I'm me thinking of you. This place has lobster mac and cheese. It's the best. Or if there's a song that you would listen to a lot with a certain, with an organizer, just like sometimes on the radio, I'll just like leave a voicemail with like the recording from the car of like whatever song. So like little things like that, just to kind of like, I think tell people you're thinking about them. And I think it's healthy to have like friends in the, in the whole activist world, because it just makes meetings go a lot easier. They're also a great source of intelligence. Someone that has kind of gone to the other side. It was nice to have friends texting me, be like, yo, they are worried, like they're doing this, and like they're kind of giving it unsolicited just because like, they're friends with me. They want to see me win and they're hearing chatter from the other campaign that's not good. So it's always helpful. But yeah, networking, I think the big thing is just like being intentional about it. And I think it's like one of those parts where it's like, it's like, it's like, how do you like, forming adult friendships are a different dynamic. And it's something I think all of you will start to navigate soon if you're not doing it already. And I think networking is one of those. And don't be afraid to just like be bold and introduce yourself. I've gotten cold calls and cold emails from random people just kind of wanting to connect about politics. So don't be afraid to send that email or that text if there's like a candidate that you're really passionate about, or you saw someone speak on a live stream and you're really impressed with them. Like give them a, try to reach out to them, try to connect. You'll find a lot of people are open to talking, especially on the politics, especially on the left side. It's like, we want more of you. So if any one of you show an interest, like we are happy to like bring you in. So yeah.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. If not, it looks like Durga has a question, so we can go ahead and let her ask her question. But I think people are probably just have so many follow-ups. So Durga, go for it.
Okay, if someone else has a question, please feel free to like cut me off. But just thinking about how exclusive politics is and also just continues to be, even though we have like social media at our fingertips, and pretty much has made politics very white for the most part. Even the Democratic Party, where a lot of the base is to support people of color and other folks. So how, as a party and as campaigners and organizers, how can we work to make politics less exclusive and encompass more groups and get people involved?
So that's a good, one concern I've always had about politics, and I know I mentioned like volunteering with a campaign, that's not accessible to everyone. And that's really kind of on a class issue. And that extends not just to students like yourselves, but also to adults. Is if you're working 2 jobs and you have 2 kids, it's hard for you to find time to phone bank or to volunteer with a campaign. So I think with campaigns, I think another, to your earlier question about COVID, I think with digital platforms and being able to campaign from home, I think that's given accessibility to a lot of folks that otherwise felt maybe I can't make it down to the campaign office, or, I can't knock on doors. So I think, just being mindful of kind of what what are some of the obstacles to volunteering on a campaign. I think some organizations are better at this than others, but it is a problem. And I think, I think one of the ways to do that is to be, again, like intentional about it. I think one thing that happens with campaigns that you see play out is oftentimes you're thrown into a campaign and it's like, you got to get a team assembled that's really good, that you can work with 24/7. You got to get them hired the next 2 weeks. And if you're kind of challenged with that, if all of you, I said, like, write down 5 names of people that you would go on a random road trip in 2 days, like write it down. It's like your friends. And like, for a lot of us, like our friend network, depending on kind of where we live and socioeconomics, like it's going to be kind of people like you. It's rare to have like, and hopefully this is changing with, with your generation, but just, as far as like where people's comfort zone and kind of like personal networks, if you said, top 5 people to jump in a car with you to drive across the country, you're going to find, I'd probably list out like, 5 guys that I grew up with. They're all white, like that sort of like kind of like unconscious bias, I think affects and trickles down into campaigns a lot. So I think when you're trying to form a team, when you're trying to open it up, you kind of just have to take the extra time and effort to be intentional about like tapping into networks that aren't where your comfort zone is. So it's an ongoing process. I think the left has gotten better about diversifying, with whether it's like actual like kind of quotas or, things saying like X amount of officers have to be, cisgender, women or, identify as women, or maybe it's like a third of all, committee spots need to be people of color. I think there's a couple different things that the left is trying to do to really make sure that space is created for a more diverse workforce. But it's a continual obstacle, and it's one that unfortunately, I don't see that, it's not changing quick enough. And if I had a good answer to how I could change that, I would tell you all. But I'm hoping all of you can help kind of think through ways to be better about that, because it is an issue. Both like I think class, gender, and race all kind of come together on campaigns that can be both beautiful. Like we've all been involved with campaigns and causes that have been a very kind of like encouraging, quilt of kind of America's potential, but also felt excluded by campaigns. That sucks, and that's just like not the message that you want to promote. And yeah, I'm just thinking like through. It's a very good question and critique, and I don't have a good enough answer on if enough people are doing enough about it. So I'm sorry to end on a low note, but it's something I think like I hope all of you are diligent about as you're kind of ascending into these political careers you're hoping to get into.
Well, with that, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For joining us. If you have anything else you want to share, please, feel free. If there's a way that people can get in touch with you and you're comfortable sharing that, feel free, but just
Sure.
thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Luke.hayes@gmail.com is my personal email. Happy to, with any follow-up questions. Other than that, yeah, just it's really encouraging to see all of you on a Zoom call, in the middle of the work week, and just being engaged. I am optimistic, and it is cliche, but like calls like these do make me very optimistic because so much has changed politically. I think for the worse, but also for the better in the last 4 or 5 years. And I don't doubt your role in kind of being part of that movement, because I'm very, very, very encouraged and excited about where this goes in the next 5 years. There's a lot of potential. There's also a lot riding on it. Like I don't think I need to bring up the climate catastrophe that awaits all of us, but please get your friends involved and your parents involved too. And thank you for having me and letting me share, any sort of insight I have into this. And I think the biggest thing is don't get discouraged. And campaigns can be a grind, but they're also, I've tried to escape them. I keep on getting pulled back into them because I've made, lifelong friends from the people I've met on this. And it's just, if you're going to fight an uphill battle, it's easier to do it with friends. That's, yeah.